The golden rays of the summer sun bathed the campus in a gentle glow as I walked out of the testing hall, the weight of my final exams finally lifting from my shoulders. It had been my most successful year yet. Straight A's across all my classes, multiple internships under my belt, and a resume that practically gleamed with promise. By all measures, I should have been celebrating. And yet, an unfamiliar unease lingered, dulling the satisfaction of my achievements. While my peers eagerly prepared for internships and summer jobs, I faced an unsettling void. No matter how many applications I sent, the responses were always the same: polite rejections, or worse, complete silence. With each passing day, the pressure grew heavier, transforming the promise of summer freedom into a looming shadow. The walk home from campus was long, but usually I welcomed it. It gave me a chance to reflect, to unwind from the noise of the day. My route took me through a quiet neighborhood of student apartments and modest homes. But one landmark always stood out: a small, incongruous cemetery nestled in the middle of the street like a forgotten remnant of another era. The cemetery exuded an air of mystery, its high iron fences crowned with jagged spikes. Towering gargoyle statues stood sentinel at each corner, their grotesque, winged forms frozen in eternal watch. Their hollow eyes seemed to peer into the heart of the cemetery, as if guarding a secret only they knew. For years I had passed it without a second thought. But today was different. As I approached, a glint of something new caught my eye. Hanging on the fence, weathered and worn, was a sign. Its bold, stark lettering was impossible to miss. Help wanted. Curiosity tugged at me. I crossed the street, the words pulling me closer. The sign directed me to a small wooden booth just inside the gate. From within, the silhouette of an elderly man shifted. As I drew nearer, he stepped into view. His sharp black suit seemed out of place, a contrast to his bright white hair and the warmth of his smile. Looking for work? His voice was deep, calm, yet carried an edge that made me pause. I hesitated, uncertain how to respond. "The sign out front. What's the job?" I asked, my voice wavering between curiosity and caution. He gestured toward the path winding deeper into the cemetery. "Why don't we walk?" Every instinct told me to turn back, but something in his demeanor, commanding yet oddly reassuring, kept me rooted in place. Against better judgment, I followed him. The rows of gravestones stretched endlessly, yet the scene was surprisingly tranquil under the late afternoon sun. Marcus, as he introduced himself, explained his role as the cemetery's keeper, a position he spoke of with pride, though his tone carried a quiet solemnity. "The job is simple," he said as we walked. "One night, that's all I need. Someone to watch over this place until morning. And for your time, I'm offering $2,000. Cash." I stopped in my tracks. $2,000 for a single night's work? My heart raced with disbelief, suspicion, and something else: temptation. "Why so much?" I asked, searching his face for an answer that never came. His expression remained calm, his gaze steady. "Take it or leave it," he said, extending a set of keys. His voice was firm, yet not unkind. "But decide now." 1,000 questions swirled in my mind. What was the catch? Why the urgency? Yet, as if on autopilot, my hand reached out. I took the keys, part desperation, part curiosity, part greed. I couldn't tell what had compelled me to agree. As Marcus disappeared between the gravestones, leaving me standing alone, I clenched the keys tightly in my hand. The stillness of the cemetery pressed in around me, heavy and expectant. My mind raced with possibilities, with fears, with what I might have just signed up for. A week passed in a blur, the days filled with celebration and half-hearted attempts at job hunting. But as the appointed night loomed, unease began to creep into the edges of my mind. The $2,000 felt both too tempting and too absurd to ignore. By the time the evening arrived, curiosity and obligation outweighed my apprehension, and I found myself walking back to the cemetery, clutching the set of keys Marcus had given me. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravestones. The air seemed heavier as I approached the cemetery gates, an oppressive silence replacing the usual neighborhood sounds. A faint but distinct scent of aged paper greeted me when I stepped into the security booth. On the desk sat an envelope addressed to the keeper. My name wasn't there, but there was no doubt who it was meant for. I opened it with trembling hands. The letter inside was written in precise, elegant handwriting, its formal and foreboding tone unmistakable. It laid out a series of rules, bizarre, unsettling, and oddly specific. Lock the cemetery gates by 8 p.m. sharp. No one was to enter or leave until sunrise. The largest key on the chain was for this gate. Evict trespassers immediately. No exceptions, even for law enforcement or emergency services. Change into the suit provided in the booth. A tailored black suit and polished shoes awaited me in the wooden closet. This will protect you, the note cryptically claimed. Draw salt circles around specific graves. These graves were listed with precise locations, and the circles were to be flawless, no gaps, no errors. Pay attention to the bells. If a bell atop a grave began to ring, it was a warning. Additional instructions would be provided in the booth if this happened. Beware of the gargoyles. The 4 statues at the cemetery's corners must remain in place. If one moved, it meant something had gone wrong. Henry's grave. The final rule was the most ominous. If danger becomes insurmountable, light a match and burn the grass atop a specific grave in the southwest corner. The name on the headstone, Henry. As I read through the list, a chill ran down my spine. The instructions sounded like the makings of a ghost story, yet Marcus's sincerity had left an undeniable impression. I checked my watch, 7:45 p.m. Time was running out. Pulling open the closet, I found the suit hanging neatly, pristine, and oddly inviting. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I changed into it. The fabric fit perfectly, unnaturally so. Once dressed, a strange sense of readiness settled over me, though I couldn't say for what. When I stepped outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The once peaceful cemetery felt transformed, like an entirely different world. The air was frigid, biting against my skin despite the midsummer season. Shadows stretched and danced in the growing darkness, and the wind whispered through the gnarled branches of the trees. The silence was suffocating. Each step I took echoed unnaturally, as if the ground beneath me held its breath. I glanced at the gate one last time before checking my watch. 7:59. The time had come. As the clock struck 8, I turned the key in the gate's heavy lock. The metallic click reverberated through the air like a thunderclap, unnaturally loud in the stillness. My hand trembled as I let the key slip from the lock. The gate was closed. The night had begun, and so had the terror. The first sign of trouble came just after 9 p.m. The cemetery, which had been eerily silent, was suddenly pierced by the faint sound of a bell ringing. It was soft at first, almost delicate, but in the crushing stillness of the night, it felt deafening. My breath caught as I froze, staring toward the sound. Marcus's instructions echoed in my mind. Pay attention to the bells. If one rings, follow the additional instructions. Clutching the canister of salt, I forced myself to move, each step heavier than the last. The bell's sound seemed to pull at me, its high-pitched chime slicing through the cold air. The rhythm felt deliberate, almost alive, as though it were calling to me. My hands trembled as I reached the grave. With shaky movements, I began sprinkling the salt around the headstone, completing a perfect circle as instructed. The moment the circle closed, the bell stopped abruptly, plunging the cemetery into an even heavier silence. The air felt thick, suffocating. I exhaled, a shuddering attempt to steady my nerves, but the relief was short-lived. Another bell rang out, then another, and another. The isolated chime had transformed into a haunting symphony, a cacophony of tones reverberating through the cemetery like some twisted orchestra. My pulse quickened as the darkness seemed to thicken, the air turning colder with each passing second. Shadows crept closer, twisting unnaturally as the gravestones loomed, jagged and menacing. I scrambled to repeat the process, encircling each ringing grave with salt as fast as I could. My movements grew frantic, sweat streaming down my face despite the chilling air. My breathing was shallow, each gasp echoing in the silence between chimes. The cemetery felt alive, its oppressive presence pressing against me. I could feel it, watching, waiting for a single misstep. And then I saw it. One of the gargoyle statues perched on the cemetery's corner pillars was gone. My stomach dropped as my eyes locked on the empty pedestal. Marcus's warning screamed in my mind. Beware of the gargoyles. If one moves, it means something has gone wrong. Panic clawed at my chest as I frantically scanned the shadows. The remaining gargoyles seemed to sneer at me, their grotesque faces frozen in malevolent mockery. My hands gripped the salt canister tightly, the metal cold and slick with sweat. The sensation of being watched intensified, a suffocating pressure that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just paranoia, I could feel it. A cold, unrelenting gaze bore into me, its presence impossible to ignore. I tried to shake off the dread, whispering reassurances to myself that it was all in my head. But then I heard it. A faint sound, subtle but unmistakable. A soft scrape, like stone grinding against stone. My breath hitched. The noise came from somewhere in the darkness, impossibly close. The salt canister slipped in my grip as my hands shook violently. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The gate was locked tight, and the instructions had been clear. I was bound to this place until sunrise. The realization hit me like a blow, and terror bloomed in my chest. The chimes of the bells faded into the background as a more immediate fear took hold. The night had only just begun, and already I was questioning whether I would survive it. The stillness of the night shattered when the ground beneath a weathered grave began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, a faint vibration that I might have mistaken for the trembling of my own legs. But then, the earth groaned, splitting apart with a sound that echoed through the cemetery like ancient stone cracking under immense pressure. My breath hitched as dirt cascaded away, revealing something clawing its way to the surface. The name etched on the headstone read Henry, but the figure emerging was far from human. A twisted form heaved itself out of the ground, its gaunt frame shrouded in what could only be described as decayed remnants of flesh. What clung to its body was like a dark, brittle husk, cracking and flaking with every jerky movement. A dark fluid dripped from its open mouth, pooling onto the disturbed earth with a faint hiss. The air around me filled with a noxious stench, sharp and acrid, twisting my stomach into knots. The figure moved with an eerie mix of stiffness and unnatural purpose. Its head snapped toward me with an audible crack and glowing orbs where its eyes should have been locked onto mine. They burned with a faint, sickly luminescence that pierced through the shadows. A primal dread washed over me, and I froze as an understanding passed between us, one that spoke of malice and hunger. Before I could react, it lunged. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding its claw-like hands. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to regain my footing, every instinct screaming at me to run. The salt canister slipped from my grasp, clattering uselessly to the ground. Fear threatened to consume me, but Marcus's words cut through the chaos in my mind. Burn the grass on Henry's grave. Desperation fueled my movements as I fumbled through my pockets for the matches. My fingers were slick with sweat, trembling violently as I struggled to open the small box. The creature advanced, its fluid movements as horrifying as they were calculated. The ground seemed to darken beneath its steps, and I could feel the air grow colder as it closed the distance between us. It wasn't shambling or slow. It moved with a terrifying speed, each step deliberate and deadly. The first match flared to life, but sputtered out almost instantly in the night air. My chest tightened as the creature loomed closer, its breath rattling in a soundless rhythm. My shaking hands struck another match, and this time I shielded it from the breeze, praying it would hold. The flame flickered but caught, its small light a beacon of hope against the surrounding darkness. I dropped the match onto the dry grass atop the grave, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden burst, flames erupted, consuming the patch of earth in a fiery glow. The figure halted, a guttural sound escaping from somewhere deep within its form, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It convulsed, its body twisting as if tethered to the flames, licking at the soil. The fire roared higher, its heat pressing against my skin, forcing me to step back. The figure collapsed in on itself, disintegrating into ash and blackened fragments that vanished into the charred ground. The flames extinguished almost as quickly as they had risen, leaving only scorched earth and an eerie silence in their wake. I stood rooted to the spot, trembling so violently I feared I might collapse. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the darkened patch of earth, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Relief flirted with my senses, but it was fleeting, quickly chased away by the oppressive stillness that surrounded me. Somehow, I knew this wasn't the end. The night had more horrors to reveal, and I wasn't sure I could face them. Henry lunged again, and for a moment I was sure it was over. His outstretched hand, skeletal and jagged, reached toward me with an unnatural, terrifying intent. My legs gave way as I stumbled back, the salt canister rolling out of my grasp. Fear froze me in place, a deep certainty gripping my mind that this would be the end. And then the air split with a deafening crack and something immense landed between us. The force of the impact knocked me to the ground, my flashlight spinning away in a wide arc. Its faint, flickering light revealed a towering figure that stood between me and Henry, a gargoyle. The stone guardian, once motionless and cold, had come to life. Its massive wings stretched outward, creating a gust that rustled the nearby trees. Claws, sharp and glinting in the weak light, flexed as if testing their power. Its face, twisted and menacing, now seemed alive, filled with an emotion that was neither human nor entirely bestial. Another impact shook the ground, followed by two more. The other gargoyles had descended from their perches, surrounding Henry in a formation that felt calculated, purposeful. The energy in the air shifted, a low hum reverberating through the ground as if the cemetery itself recognized their presence. Henry let out a piercing cry that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. He lunged toward the nearest gargoyle, his movements unnervingly quick and erratic. But the gargoyle countered with an almost effortless swipe of its claw, sending Henry hurtling back. The remaining gargoyles closed in, their heavy stone forms moving with an otherworldly grace, their strikes precise and unyielding. I watched in stunned silence as the conflict unfolded. The flashlight's sputtering beam cast fragmented shadows of the chaos, figures colliding, darkened forms twisting in unnatural ways. Henry lashed out, the very ground seeming to darken beneath his movements, but the gargoyles pressed forward. Their unity was unsettling. They moved as though guided by a shared purpose, relentless in their assault. The air grew heavy, filled with the grinding of stone and the unnatural sounds of Henry's defiance. My chest tightened as I pressed myself against a headstone, desperate to stay out of sight. The ground beneath them darkened further as the clash continued, the forces at play too immense to comprehend fully. Finally, the largest gargoyle stepped forward, its presence commanding and final. It struck with terrifying precision, driving Henry to the ground. The earth shuddered under the impact, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness as Henry's form crumbled beneath the immense weight of the gargoyle's power. As the dust settled, only a dark, scorched patch of earth remained where Henry had stood moments before. The gargoyles lingered for a moment, their forms still and silent as if ensuring their task was complete. Then, one by one, they turned and ascended back to their perches. In the faint light, they appeared once again as nothing more than cold stone, their movements erased as if they had never happened. I sat trembling in the dirt, unable to move. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the patch of scorched ground, the only evidence of what I had just witnessed. The cemetery was quiet now, but the silence felt alive, pressing against me with an oppressive weight. The gargoyles, motionless and unyielding, watched over the cemetery once more, their grotesque faces unreadable. I didn't feel relief. The quiet was too heavy, the night too charged with something unseen and unknowable. The events I had witnessed replayed in my mind, but they defied understanding. The cemetery was at rest again, but the air carried the weight of secrets better left untouched. As I sat in the cold dirt, one thought consumed me. I had survived this night, but the shadows of this place would haunt me forever. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in muted pinks and oranges, yet the sight brought no relief. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled toward the gate, the massive key cold and heavy in my trembling hand. Each step was a struggle, my body drained and my mind spinning from the horrors I had endured. The silence of the cemetery was deafening, the kind that pressed down like an unseen force, refusing to let me leave it behind. The key turned with a metallic click, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The gate creaked open, its hinges groaning as though reluctant to let me go. For a moment I hesitated, turning to glance back at the cemetery. The gargoyles had returned to their perches, unmoving, their grotesque faces staring inward, guarding secrets I couldn't fathom. The ground where Henry had been destroyed was dark, scorched, a scar that seemed to pulse faintly in the soft light of dawn. The cemetery appeared unchanged, but I knew better. It had a way of hiding its truths, burying them beneath layers of stone and soil. I stepped through the gate, closing it behind me with trembling hands. The key's weight felt heavier now as I locked it, sealing away whatever was still lurking inside. As I began to walk away, the distant toll of a church bell startled me, freezing me in place. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought the cemetery's bells had started ringing again. My breath hitched, but the sound faded, leaving only the whisper of leaves in the morning breeze and the pounding of my heart. Even as I moved farther from the cemetery, it refused to let me go. The air felt colder than it should have, and an invisible weight lingered on my shoulders. My skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes watching my every move. Marcus's words echoed in my mind, "No one good is buried here." What did he mean? The question twisted in my thoughts, gnawing at me, growing heavier with every step. When I finally reached home, my body cried out for rest, but my mind was a storm of memories I couldn't escape. The $2,000 sat untouched in my backpack, no longer feeling like a reward. It was tainted, a cruel reminder of everything I had seen. I collapsed onto my bed, desperate for even a moment of peace, but sleep offered no sanctuary. The nightmares began the moment I closed my eyes. Henry's glowing, diseased eyes stared back at me, unblinking, unrelenting. His wheezing breath, a sound that scraped like rusted metal, filled the air, and his twisted form loomed closer with every fleeting moment of rest. I woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air as the phantom scent of decay clawed at my senses. It lingered long after I opened my eyes, as real as the sheets tangled around me. Even in the waking hours, the nightmares refused to release me. In the stillness of my apartment, I could hear faint bells tolling, soft and distant at first. Then they grew louder, insistent, until I clamped my hands over my ears, only to realize the sound wasn't external. It was inside my head, and the smell. No matter how much I scrubbed or how many windows I opened, the cloying stench of rot followed me, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my very skin. Marcus's cryptic warning haunted me. No one good is buried here. What had he meant? Why had I been chosen to survive that night? The questions churned endlessly, each one more unsettling than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen was only the surface, a glimpse into something far darker. A part of me feared that the real horror hadn't even begun. The days passed, but the shadow of that night never lifted. It clung to me, an invisible weight, a haunting presence I couldn't escape. Even as the sun rose higher each morning, the memory of the cemetery's secrets lingered, etched into my soul like the scarred earth where Henry had been destroyed. And as I sat alone in the silence, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. I wasn't sure if I had truly left the cemetery, or if it had followed me home. The days turned into weeks, but the memories of that night refused to fade. Each unanswered question only grew louder, echoing in the silence of my thoughts. Who was Marcus, truly? Why did he need someone to watch over the cemetery for just one night? And what exactly was I guarding against? The rules Marcus had left behind felt more like riddles than instructions, measures meant to keep me alive but never to enlighten me about the forces at play. The salt circles, the bells, the gargoyles, they each had a purpose, but one I couldn't fully understand. And then there was Henry. His grotesque, nightmarish form haunted my mind. Was he a victim of the cemetery's curse, or something far older and far worse? I replayed every moment of that night, every word Marcus had said. His calm, composed demeanor now seemed more unnerving than reassuring. No one good is buried here. The phrase looped endlessly in my mind. Did he mean Henry? Or was there something darker buried in the cemetery's forgotten corners, waiting? Despite the terror that night instilled in me, I couldn't deny the pull of the cemetery. It lingered, a magnetic force that tugged at my thoughts. It wasn't done with me, or perhaps I wasn't done with it. The $2,000 I had earned now felt meaningless compared to the weight of what I'd witnessed. I didn't want peace anymore. I wanted answers. On a cold, moonlit night, I found myself standing in front of the cemetery gate once again. I didn't remember deciding to come back, but there I was. The towering iron fence loomed before me, its spiked tips catching the faint light of the moon. The gargoyles perched silently, their grotesque forms motionless, but I knew better. They weren't just stone. They were watchers, guardians of secrets buried deep within. I stared at the gate I had locked at sunrise, my fingers brushing against the cold, unyielding metal. The memory of the key's weight lingered in my mind, vivid and oppressive. A part of me screamed to turn back, to leave the horrors of that place behind forever. But another part, a stronger, more insistent voice, urged me forward. It whispered of mysteries unsolved, of truths buried beneath layers of soil and shadow. The wind stirred, carrying a sound that made my breath hitch, a faint, familiar toll, a bell. The distant chime echoed from somewhere deep within the cemetery, haunting and deliberate. My heart raced as my eyes darted to the statues. They remained still, their grotesque faces fixed in eternal grimaces, but their presence felt heavier, as if they were watching, waiting. I stood frozen, my thoughts a tangle of fear and irresistible curiosity. The night stretched endlessly around me, and the choice loomed large, weighing down every second. My feet moved forward, hesitantly, almost against my will. I stepped closer to the gate, and then I hesitated. The story ends here, with me standing at the threshold, caught between two fates. Would I step inside and face the truths I craved, no matter the cost? Or would I turn back, leaving the cemetery's secrets to slumber, forever unanswered, in the shadows of my mind? Some doors, they say, are better left closed. But this wasn't one of them.